I'm Thomas. I like digging up old books nobody reads anymore. Occult stuff, lost scriptures, that sort of thing. Figured you might enjoy them too. Settle in, let's begin. Oh, and if you feel so inclined, give the channel a like and subscribe for more content. Everyone thinks they know the Knights Templar, the Red Cross, the treasure, the whispered conspiracies. What fewer people know is the real history, which is quite extraordinary on its own. This account, drawn from F.C. Woodhouse's study on the medieval military orders, follows the Templars from 9 poor knights guarding the pilgrim roads to Jerusalem, to the richest and most powerful brotherhood in Christendom, to their annihilation at the hands of a king who owed them money. I chose it because the plain facts need no embroidery. There were monks who were also soldiers and bankers, and their sudden ruin, the mass arrests, the confessions wrung out under torture, the last Grand Master burned at the stake, left a wound in the medieval imagination that never quite closed. Before all the myths, there was the history. Here it is, told plainly and told well. The Knights Templar, Rise and Fall, by F.C. Woodhouse, published in 1879.
Verily I say unto you, there is no man that hath left house, or brethren, or sisters, or father, or mother, or wife, or children, or lands, for my sake and the gospel's. But he shall receive 100-fold now in this time, houses and brethren, and sisters, and mothers, and children, and lands with persecutions, and in the world to come eternal life. St. Mark X. Foundation of the Order of the Temple, St. Bernard aids the order, Constitution of the Order, St. Bernard's account of the Templars, the Christian power in the East weakened, the Second Crusade, the Siege of Damascus, Letter of a Knight Templar, exploits of the Templars in Palestine. The firmest bulwark of Jerusalem was founded on the Knights of the Hospital and of the Temple, the strange association of a monastic and military life, Gibbon. It was during the brief tenure of Jerusalem and the Holy Land by the Christian kings, set up after the successful issue of the First Crusade, that the Order of the Knights Templars had its beginning. There does not seem to have been in the origin of this order any special care of pilgrims at Jerusalem, as was the case with the Hospitallers. It was from the first a purely military foundation, but bound by religious vows and under the strictest discipline. The earliest names in connection with the order are those of Hugh de Payens and Geoffrey de Saint-Omer, who, with 7 other gentlemen, dedicated themselves as the poor soldiers of Jesus Christ to fight in defense of the holy places and to keep the roads to them free and safe for pilgrims. In addition to this, they took the usual 3 vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience after the manner of canons regular. In AD 1118, during the reign of Baldwin II, king of Jerusalem, a house was granted them upon Mount Moriah, where the temple had stood. From this house they came to be known as the Knights Templars. The first Templars were brave and tried soldiers who had already done good service during the Crusade, and their reputation and the honorable object of their brotherhood soon attracted kindred spirits to their side. At first they were very poor, and their seal represented 2 knights riding upon 1 horse. St. Bernard was at this time in the zenith of his reputation, and Baldwin, seeing the value of such an order for the maintenance of the Latin kingdom in the East, sent a deputation of 2 knights to solicit his intercession with the Pope for the authoritative establishment of the Templars. Bernard gladly assisted the scheme, and through his influence the order was formally recognized at the Council of Troyes, AD 1128. The rule and statutes of the order were drawn up by Bernard himself, founded as far as possible upon the Cistercian rule, and were therefore of the strictest and most ascetic character. The brethren were to be regular and constant in public and private devotions, to speak little, to give alms, to be gentle and courteous to the weak, the aged, the sick, to observe the fast days, and never to have anything but a spare and frugal diet. The garment of the knights was to be white, to remind them to commend themselves to their Creator by a pure life. No gold or silver was to be upon their bridles, armor, or spurs. No hunting or hawking was permitted. probationers were to be well tried before they were permitted to enter the order and take the vows, and no person was to be admitted till he was of years of discretion. Transgressions of the rule were to be punished with severity by stripes, temporary separation of the offender from his brethren, and other penalties. After the confirmation of the order and its rule by the Pope, Hugh de Payens traveled through France and came to England. Noblemen and gentlemen soon joined him, and gifts of money and lands came in freely, and King Stephen himself favored the order. In France, men of the highest rank enrolled themselves, but no favor was shown to them on account of their birth and blood. All were equal as Templars, and those who had been guilty of crimes or excesses were required to make reparation and undergo prolonged probation. Some even of royal blood left their dominions and retired to the ranks of the Templars, and almost every country in Europe soon had its house and branch of the order. Bernard continued his support and published a treatise in praise of the new chivalry addressed to Hugh, Knight of Christ and Master of the Knighthood of Christ, in which he contrasts the temper and habits of ordinary knights and their warfare with the high and noble aims and practice of the Knights of the Temple, and concludes with a high-flown apostrophe to Jerusalem as the seat of this order, the mistress of the nations, and the glory of the Christian people. Alas, how often have good men's high hopes and ideals been frustrated and broken down. The Templars, says St. Bernard, lived together in an agreeable but frugal manner, without wives or children, or having anything in property to themselves, even so much as their own will. They are never idle, nor rambling abroad, and when they are not in the field marching against the infidels, they are either fitting up their arms in the harness of their horses, or else employing themselves in pious exercises by order of their superior. An insolent expression, immoderate laughter, or the least murmur does not pass without a severe correction. They detest cards and dice. They are never allowed the diversion of hunting or useless visits. They abominate all shows, drolleries, discourses, or songs of a loose nature. They bathe but seldom, are generally in an undress, their face burnt with the sun, and their look grave and solemn. When they are entering into an engagement, they arm themselves with faith within and with steel without, having no ornaments either upon their dress or upon the accoutrements of their horses. Their arms are their only finery, and they make use of them with courage, without being daunted, either at the number or force of the barbarians. All their confidence is in the Lord of hosts, and in fighting for his cause they seek a sure victory, or a Christian and honorable death. In AD 1129, Hugh de Payens, having seen his order established in almost every country in Europe, and daily increasing in numbers and influence, returned to Palestine at the head of a considerable body of knights, and plans were immediately arranged for the protection and extension of the Latin kingdom. Hugh de Payens, the first Grand Master, died in AD 1136, and was succeeded by Lord Robert, son-in-law of Anselm, Archbishop of Canterbury, who after the death of his wife had taken the vows and habit of the Templars. But evil times were coming upon the Christians in the East. The Muslim had found a new and able leader in Zingis, who with his son Nuruddin aroused them to fresh activity and aggression. Several battles were fought, in all of which the Christians were defeated, and city and fortress, one after another, fell into the hands of the followers of the Prophet, till at last the important stronghold of Edessa was captured, and the Christian dominion in Palestine was in the greatest peril. An appeal was made to the Pope, who commissioned Bernard to preach a second crusade. A general chapter of the Templars was held in Paris, AD 1146, at which the King of France, Louis VII, the Pope, Eugenius III, and a multitude of bishops and nobles from every country of Christendom, together with 130 Templars, were present. It was on this occasion that the Templars placed upon their white habits and mantles the red cross, already referred to, which became henceforth the distinguishing badge of the order, so that they were commonly called Red Friars or Red Cross Knights. In the following year, the Second Crusading Army marched, the rear being protected by the Templars under Everard de Bar, who was now Grand Master, and we are told by the French chronicler Odo, the king's chaplain, that the whole army was edified by the high and noble example of military discipline, frugality, and temperance set by the Templars. The campaign began with the siege of Damascus, and Louis, King of France, and Conrad, Emperor of Germany, joined their armies to stem the advancing torrent of the enemy. But the Muslim were almost everywhere victorious, and the Christians reduced to the greatest straits. The following extract from a letter sent by the Templars to their master, who had returned to France with King Louis, will best explain their condition. Since we have been deprived of your beloved presence, we have had the misfortune to lose in battle the Prince of Antioch and all his nobility. To this catastrophe has succeeded another. The infidels invaded the territory of Antioch and drove all before them. On intelligence of this, our brethren assembled in arms and went to the succor of the desolated province. We could only get together 120 knights and 1,000 serving brothers and hired soldiers. Your paternity knows our extreme want of money, cavalry, and infantry, and we earnestly implore you to rejoin us as soon as possible, with all the necessary succors for the Eastern Church, our common mother. Scarcely had we arrived in the neighborhood of Antioch when we were hemmed in by the Turkomans on the one side and the Sultan of Aleppo on the other. The greater part of those whom we led are dead. We conjure you to bring all our knights and serving brothers capable of bearing arms. Perchance with all your diligence you may not find one of us alive. Use therefore all imaginable celerity. Pray forget not the necessities of our house. They are such that no tongue can express them. It is also of the last importance to announce to the Pope, the King of France, and all the princes and prelates of Europe the approaching desolation of the Holy Land, to the intent they may succor us in person or send us subsidies. Whatever obstacles may be opposed to your departure, we trust to your zeal to surmount them. For now hath arrived the time for perfectly accomplishing our vows and sacrificing ourselves for the defense of the Eastern Church and the Holy Sepulchre. On receipt of this melancholy letter, the master, not feeling himself equal to cope with the difficulties of the situation, resigned his office and retired to the monastery of Clairvaux, and Bernard de Tremolay, a nobleman of high rank and distinguished reputation as a soldier, was elected to succeed him, AD 1151. In the meantime, the Muslim army advanced upon Jerusalem, and for a time encamped upon the Mount of Olives, till, having been defeated in a pitched battle, they retired again beyond the Jordan. Shortly after this, the Templars attempted, unaided and alone, to storm the city of Ascalon, and having breached the walls, they penetrated to the very center of the town, but were then overpowered by numbers and were slaughtered to a man. Contemporary accounts of the valor of the Templars, the constitution of the order, castles and convents in Palestine and elsewhere, the temple in London, in Paris. The Knights of the Temple ever maintained their fearless and fanatic character. If they neglected to live, they were prepared to die in the service of Christ. Gibbon. The next Grand Master was Bertrand de Blancfort, a pious and God-fearing man of a noble family in Guyenne, AD 1154. Again, the Templars were always in the forefront of every battle and performed prodigies of valor, which caused them to be honored in every country of Europe, and they were styled by the Pope the New Maccabees, and Saint Bernard thus describes their prowess. When the conflict has begun, they throw aside their former gentleness, exclaiming, "Do not I hate them, O Lord, that hate thee?" They rush in upon their adversaries, in no wise fearing, though few in number, the fierce barbarism and the immense number of the enemy. So in a wonderful manner they are seen to be more gentle than lambs, and more fierce than lions, so that I almost doubt which I had better call them, monks or soldiers, unless, perhaps, as more fitting, I call them both the one and the other. Another eyewitness of the exploits of the Templars, Cardinal de Vitry, Bishop of Acre, gives a similar glowing description of their heroic courage. When summoned to arms, they never demand the number of the enemy, but only where they are. Fierce soldiers they are in war, monks in religion, to the enemies of Christ inexorable, to Christians kind and gracious. They carry before to battle a banner half black and half white, which they call Beauséant, because they are fair and favorable to the friends of Christ, but black and terrible to his enemies. Amalric, king of Jerusalem, in a letter to the king of France says, "We earnestly entreat your majesty constantly to extend to the utmost your favor and regard to the brothers of the temple, who continually render up their lives for God and the faith, and through whom we do the little that we are able to effect. For in them, indeed, after God, is placed the entire reliance of all in the East. The Patriarch of Jerusalem, and an eyewitness of the conduct of the Templars in battle, tells us that they were always foremost in the fight and last in retreat, that they proceeded to battle in the greatest order and in silence, that when the signal to engage was given by their commander, the trumpets were sounded, and then they sang Psalm CXV, "Not unto us, O Lord," etc., and placing their lances in rest they conquered or died, that if anyone turned back or displayed want of courage, the white mantle of his order was ignominiously stripped off his shoulders, and he was compelled to eat on the ground for the space of a whole year, and be separated from his brethren. The Patriarch concludes, "The Templars do indeed practice a stern religion, living in humble obedience to their master, without property, and spending nearly all their lives under tents in the open fields." Saint Bernard wrote on his deathbed 3 letters in behalf of the order, AD 1153. Indeed, there can be no question that up to this time the order most literally fulfilled its promise, and was the right arm of the Christians in the East. Over and over again the ranks of the knights were thinned. Often not a man survived the battle, but recruits came in, and brave and devoted men from every country in Europe, especially England and France, were ready to join the forlorn hope, to defend the holy places, or to die for them. If courage and self-sacrifice could have saved the Latin kingdom, it would have continued. But the supineness of European monarchs, and their jealousies and quarrels between themselves, soon left the East almost defenseless, till the crescent supplanted the cross, and all the blood shed and zeal expended were lost and wasted. The order of the Knights Templars had now arrived at its complete organization. It consisted of 3 ranks or classes: the knights, the clergy, and the serving brethren. The knights were required to be men of gentle or noble birth, no person of low degree being admissible. The priests were the chaplains of the order, whose duty it was to conduct the services in the churches belonging to its convents, and to follow the camp and minister to the members when they were in the field. The serving brethren acted as esquires to the knights, both in the field and at home. The Grand Master ranked as a sovereign prince, and had precedence of all ambassadors and peers in the councils of the church. Each country had its Grand Prior, and these together formed a chapter whom the master called together, generally in Paris, when any great business required deliberation and counsel, and local chapters were held in different districts under the care of its preceptor. Besides these, the knights had in their pay and under their command a large number of troops, both cavalry and infantry. The government of the order was vested in the hands of the Grand Master, who resided at the Mother House in Jerusalem. The next in rank to him was the Marshal, who was the master's lieutenant, the acting general in the field, and the commander of the order during a vacancy in the office of Grand Master. The prior or preceptor of the Kingdom of Jerusalem was the grand treasurer of the order and the guardian of the chief house in Jerusalem. The draper had the charge of the clothing of all the brethren. The standard-bearer carried the banner beosiant to the field of battle. The turcopiler was the commander of a body of light horse, called turcopilers, mostly native Christians of Syria, or who were clothed and armed in Asiatic style, and were enrolled, drilled, and officered by the Templars, and being accustomed to the climate and acquainted with the country and the Eastern method of warfare, were valuable as light cavalry. The guardian of the chapel had the charge of the portable chapel, which the Templars always carried with them in their campaigns. It was a round tent which was pitched always in the center of the camp, the quarters of the brethren being disposed round it. There were also grand preceptors of Antioch and Tripoli, and preceptors of the houses in Syria and elsewhere, all of whom commanded in the field. William of Tyre says of the order in his day, when in the zenith of its prosperity, they have in their convent at Jerusalem more than 300 knights, besides serving brothers innumerable. Their possessions are so vast that there cannot now be a province in Christendom which does not contribute to their support, and their wealth is said to equal that of sovereign princes. In Palestine, besides their great house at Jerusalem, they had many strongholds in different parts of the country: Gaza, the southern frontier town; Safed on the north; the castle of the pilgrims near Mount Carmel; the fortress of Jaffa and that of Acre. Indeed, the greater part of the Holy Land was in their hands, or in those of the Hospitallers. They had houses at Aleppo, Laodicea, Beirut, and many other places. In Apulia and Sicily they held estates, castles, and other property. They had establishments in Lucca, Milan, Perugia, Placentia, Bologna, and in other cities in Italy. In Portugal they had estates and castles, and were constantly in conflict with the Moors. In Spain they had large possessions, and in the Balearic Islands. In Germany they were settled at Mayence and other cities on the Rhine. They had footing in Bavaria, Hungary, Bohemia, and Moravia. They had a house in Constantinople and others in Greece. In France their possessions were so large and their establishments so numerous that it would occupy too much space to enumerate them. Holland and the Netherlands also had convents of the order. In England there were a great many Templar houses, some of which are still traceable by the names of the villages, e.g. Templecombe, Temple Rothley, Temple Newsome, etc. In almost every country they had either preceptories or estates, and in Scotland and Ireland also they had both. Besides actual property and convents, they received from kings and princes many privileges, immunities from taxation, tithes, etc. The right of sanctuary was granted to their establishments. The master of the temple in England had a seat in Parliament as a baron. The first English convent of the order was near Southampton Buildings in Chancery Lane, where some remains of the ruins of the chapel were found some years ago. When the order increased, they purchased an estate just outside the city gate and adjacent to the Thames, where a magnificent convent was built. Of this nothing remains but the circular part of the church, which was consecrated by Heraclius, Patriarch of Jerusalem, in AD 1184, in the reign of King Henry II, shortly after the murder of Thomas à Becket at Canterbury. The king often held his court at the temple, and it was sometimes used as a depository for treasure. The same may be said of the temple in Paris, which was also a very extensive and magnificent building, all trace of which, however, is gone, except in the names of the streets which occupy its site. Before its destruction, it was used as a prison, and there the unfortunate Louis XVI and Marie Antoinette were confined till released by death. And here the still more miserable Dauphin, their son, and the heir to the throne of France, endured the cruelties of the inhuman cobbler Simon, to whom the Revolution had committed him, to break his spirit and wear out his young life by a system of revolting and degrading barbarities, which slowly tortured him to death. The power and influence of the Templars in European affairs was now very great. They were employed in all sorts of important negotiations between kings, treaties, marriages, loans, quarrels religious, private, and political. The Templars had something to do with all. A multitude of important state papers are dated from the temple, and the knights often acted as mediators in the misunderstandings between the Pope and the European sovereigns. Jealousy and charges against the Templars. Operations in the East. Saladin captures the Grand Master. Battle of Tiberias. Apostasy or death. Jerusalem taken. The Templars retire to Antioch. Letter of Brother Thierry. The Third Crusade. Battle of Ramleh. Account by an eyewitness. Castles of the Templars. Expedition against Egypt. Letter of the Grand Master. Misfortunes in Egypt. Jerusalem retaken. And Vivien, frowning in true anger, said, "They ride abroad redressing human wrongs. They sit with knife and meat and wine and horn. They bound to holy vows of chastity. Were I not woman, I could tell a tale. But you are man, you well can understand the shame that cannot be explained for shame." Then answered Merlin, careless of her words, "You breathe but accusation vast and vague, spleen-born, I think, and proofless. If you know, set up the charge you know to stand or fall." Tennyson. The wealth and power of the order, while they commanded influence throughout Europe, nevertheless aroused jealousies and difficulties, but too sadly foreshadowing the terrible end that was to come by and by. Complaints were made by the bishops of the injuries which were inflicted upon their rights and authority by the withdrawal of the churches of the order from their jurisdiction, and in some cases acts of violence were charged upon the knights. No doubt there were good grounds for many of these complaints, for the Templars were but men, And where so many were admitted, some must have been unworthy, or have fallen under temptation. And it was natural that the transgressor should look to his order to defend and uphold him when the consequences of his fault overtook him. Then their esprit de corps would lead them to favor him, and however they might punish him themselves, they would shield him from public disgrace and conviction. The peculiar privileges and rights granted to the order also led to collisions with the civil power, and disputes arose as to the payment of taxes and other levies, many persons claiming exemption through some connection which they had with the Templars. But we must return to the operations of the Templars in the East. While Odo de Saint Armand was Grand Master, a new and formidable enemy appeared. Saladin was now supreme ruler of the Muslim. He collected an immense army and encountered the Christians at Ascalon, AD 1177, but he was defeated and barely escaped with his life. In the following year, however, he was again in the field, and another tremendous battle was fought near the Jordan when the Grand Master and all the knights engaged were either killed or taken prisoners. Some of these Saladin ordered to be sawn in sunder. Saladin desired to exchange his nephew, who was a prisoner in the hands of the Templars, for the Grand Master, but the latter declared that a Templar could not submit to this, and he died in prison. The Christians' position became so critical through the successes of Saladin that a deputation was sent to Europe to rouse the kings and nobles to their defense, but with small success. A series of most bloody and terrible conflicts continued to be fought in Palestine, in all of which the Knights Templars and Hospitallers took prominent part, but sustained terrible losses, and if wounded, were subjected to most cruel indignities and tortures by their enemies. At the Great Battle of Tiberias, Saladin commanded an army of 80,000 men, and the Christians sustained a crushing defeat. The Templars and Hospitallers performed prodigies of valor, but were overwhelmed by numbers. Many of them were slain, but the Grand Master, together with the King of Jerusalem and others, were taken prisoners. The day after the battle, Saladin held a review of his victorious army, and then ordered his prisoners out into the midst, and offered them the alternative of apostasy to Muslim or death. To a man they chose the latter, and 230 were at once beheaded. Jerusalem was then besieged, and on October 20, 1187, it was taken, and the crescent was placed once more upon the temple buildings, and the Templars made Antioch their central house. The following letter, written by a Templar at the time, will give a picture of the state of feeling caused by the defeat at Tiberias. Brother Theory, Grand Preceptor, the poor convent, and whole order, but now almost reduced to nothing, to all the preceptors, and all our brethren of the temple, send greeting in him into whom we address our groans, and whom the sun and the moon adore. We cannot, our dearest brethren, express to you by these letters, nor even by tears of blood, all the calamities that our sins have drawn upon our heads. The Turkomans, that barbarous nation, having covered the face of the land, we advanced to relieve the castle of Tiberias, which those infidels were besieging. An engagement ensued, but the enemy having driven us to rocks and craggy mountains, our troops were cut in pieces, 30,000 men falling in that fatal day. The king is taken, and what is still more deplorable, the precious wood of the true cross is fallen into the hands of the enemy. Saladin, to crown his victory, has cut off the heads of 230 of our brethren who were taken in battle, without reckoning 60 others that were lost in the former engagement. The sovereign of the barbarians is already master of the principal towns of the kingdom. The Christians have nothing left but Jerusalem, Ascalon, Tyre, and Berytus, and the garrisons and chief inhabitants of these places perished in the battle of Tiberias, so that it is impossible, without the assistance of heaven and your succor, to preserve them. The terrible tidings of the loss of Jerusalem filled Europe with consternation and sorrow, and a new enthusiasm was kindled for its recovery. Every country contributed its contingent of men and money. Every Templar was summoned, and in the spring of the year 1189, a large army marched from Tyre to lay siege to Acre. Again, battle after battle was fought, and it was computed that 100,000 Christians fell in the year. In 1191, the Third Crusade was preached, and Philip Augustus, King of France, and Kichard Coeur de Lion, King of England, together with a multitude of nobles and their followers from every part of Europe, landed in Palestine, and shortly afterwards Acre was surrendered, and the Templars established their central house there. Another great battle was fought at Molay. An eyewitness gives an interesting account of the Muslim army. He says that it was of enormous strength, and that as far as eye could reach, on all sides there was nothing to be seen but a very forest of spears, above which floated banners and standards innumerable. The wild Bedouins rushed hither and thither in flying squadrons, shooting their arrows and filling the air with their cries, accompanied by trumpets and kettle drums. The victory, however, remained with the Christian army, and Saladin retired towards Jerusalem. Throughout the campaign, the Templars and Hospitallers fought side by side, and their experience and knowledge of the country caused them to be the real leaders and directors of all operations, Coeur de Lion himself seeking and following their advice. Several strong fortresses were erected at this time by the Templars, the most remarkable of which was called the Pilgrims' Castle, on the coast road from Acre to Jerusalem, near Mount Carmel. Two enormous towers, 100 feet high and 74 feet wide, formed the chief feature. The castle was so extensive that it could shelter 4,000 men. There were two walls, 15 feet thick and 40 feet high, and there was a beautiful church within the enclosure. In AD 1218, an expedition was fitted out against Egypt, and the Templars furnished a number of galleys and a considerable force. The Grand Master at this time was William de Chartres, and a letter of his to the Pope describes the condition of the Christian cause in the East. It is addressed to the Very Reverend Father in Christ, the Lord Honorius, by the providence of God, Chief Pontiff of the Holy Roman Church, by William de Chartres, humble master of the poor chivalry of the Temple. It states that since the arrival of a large force of crusaders from Germany and other parts of Christendom, Saladin had remained in Egypt and had made no attack upon any of the Christian possessions in Palestine, and that the Muslim power was weaker than it had been for many years. There had been, however, a failure in the crops and great scarcity of food in consequence, by which they had lost a great number of their horses and had not sufficient to mount their knights. No sooner had the crusading army landed at Damietta than a terrible pestilence broke out, and the Grand Master and many of the knights, together with a vast number of the rank and file of the army, were carried off by it. The fighting during the campaign was exceedingly fierce and bloody. On one occasion, the Saracens surprised the camp, and panic had seized upon all, when the serried ranks of the Templars appeared, and stopped the advance of the enemy and the flight of the Christians. Sometimes the fighting was upon the Nile itself. In one of these naval engagements, a galley belonging to the Templars sank, and all on board were drowned. In the end, however, Damietta was taken. In the following year, a great disaster happened to the Christian army. During a march, the enemy cut some of the banks of the canals and completely surrounded the Christian army with water. Provisions and baggage were lost, many were drowned, and the leaders were obliged to make terms, and they purchased their lives by the hard alternative of the surrender of the city of Damietta, which had cost so much blood and labor. In Palestine, the war continued with varying fortune, but all accounts agree in praising the valor and devotion of the Templars and Hospitallers, who constantly fought side by side. On one occasion, the Templars were entirely surrounded by a superior force, and, refusing to surrender, they fell to the last man, covered with wounds. An English knight, Reginald d'Argenton, was standard-bearer, and, though dreadfully wounded, bore the banner aloft till he was cut down with all his comrades. In AD 1222, the Christian cause again prevailed, and Jerusalem was recaptured. The Templars and Hospitallers once more occupied their old quarters and taxed their resources to the utmost to rebuild and strengthen the fortifications of the city. The churches were reopened for divine service, and pilgrims worshipped at the holy places after more than 50 years' exclusion. Other fortresses in different parts of the country were also rebuilt with enormous defenses, as their ruins still testify. Jerusalem taken by the Tartars, atrocities, siege of Acre, council of lions, a new crusade proposed, its failure, capture of Damietta, exploits of the Templars, the Sultan of Egypt invades Palestine, siege and capture of Acre, Palestine lost to the Christians. The loud war trumpet woke the morn, the quivering drum, the pealing horn. From rank to rank the cry is borne, aroused to death or victory, Hogg. But a new enemy now appeared in the Tartars, who everywhere gained victories and massacred the inhabitants of cities and castles. At the Battle of Gaza, the Grand Masters of the Temple and the hospital were both slain, together with 312 Templars and a multitude of soldiers. And finally, in AD 1244, Jerusalem was taken by assault, and the Tartars were found to be infinitely worse enemies than the Saracens had been. The holy places which the latter had respected were treated with contempt by the Tartars, and defiled with every insolent sacrilege. Unarmed priests, nuns, and persons of all ages and ranks were cruelly tortured, outraged, and murdered. Even the graves of the dead were violated, and their ashes flung to the winds. The remnant that escaped retired to Acre, whither they were speedily followed and besieged by the enemy. Again, piteous and earnest letters were dispatched by the master to the Christian powers in Europe, imploring aid and trying to excite their religious zeal and indignation by describing the ruin of the Christian cause in the East and the invasion of the holy places by degraded and native Asiatics. A council was assembled at Lyons by Pope Innocent IV, and it was resolved that another crusade should be preached. A truce of 4 years between all Christian princes was commanded, and contributions levied upon the income of all the clergy and earnestly solicited from the laity. But Bernard was no longer living to preach. The crusading spirit had cooled down, and there was but a feeble response, so that the Templars and Hospitallers were left almost unsupported to maintain the Christian cause in the East. In this extremity, a truce was agreed upon between the Knights and the Sultan, which caused great dissatisfaction in Europe, and gave the first ground for those charges against the Templars which were soon to become so fatal. In AD 1249, another expedition was fitted out against Egypt, and sailed from Acre, which succeeded in taking Damietta. Joinville gives many details of the campaign, and especially dwells on the exploits of the Templars, for courage and endurance seem ever to have distinguished the order throughout its whole course. And though the knights were single and there was no hereditary succession, there never was wanting a continuous supply of brave and devoted men of the best families of Europe to join the Templars and fill up the wide gaps in their ranks made by death upon the battlefield, and disease through unhealthy camps and long marches and terrible privations. But the end was coming. In AD 1262, Bibars, the Sultan of Egypt, invaded Palestine with an immense army. To meet this, there remained no forces but those of the Templars and Hospitallers, and though every battle was obstinately contested and every inch of ground fought for with courage and endurance, yet the power of numbers gradually told, and the Sultan constantly advanced, till nearly every Christian stronghold fell into his hands. The two orders of military knights were almost annihilated, and the Latin kingdom extinguished. A brief change of fortune was effected by the arrival of Prince Edward at Acre, but he was soon after recalled to England by the death of his father and his own accession to the throne. In AD 1291, Acre was invested by the Sultan and an almost countless army. No succor had come from Europe, and none was now to be expected. There was evidently but one end possible. The city must ultimately be taken, and with it would go the last hold of the Christians upon the Holy Land. The Templars and Hospitallers had vessels at their command lying off Acre, and they might have escaped, but, true to their chivalrous vows, they remained to the last, to die when they could not conquer and would not retreat. The aged, the sick, the women and children were sent to Cyprus, and then the knights set themselves to the forlorn hope of resisting the overwhelming forces of the besiegers. For 6 long weeks, the unequal conflict was maintained. The Sultan seemed to have unlimited supplies of men and materials. Engines and towers were erected against the fortifications. Mines were run under the walls. But the brave defenders of the city met mine with countermine, burnt the engines, and made sallies, and destroyed the works of the enemy. The king of Cyprus gave up hope, and basely abandoned the city with all his forces. And the garrison being thus weakened, a breach was made in the walls, and the enemy rushed in and penetrated the town, but were then met by the Templars and Hospitallers, and driven by them through the streets with great slaughter, and so the town was saved for that day. A few days longer the contest was continued. A truce was proposed, but the Sultan ordered those who came to negotiate it to be beheaded. The archives of the order were dispatched to Cyprus, and the small remaining band of knights shut themselves up in the massive tower of the temple, determined to fight to the last. Their fate was not long delayed. The Sultan caused mines to be made under the walls till they fell with a tremendous crash, burying the last defenders of the city and of the Holy Land in the shapeless ruins. With the capture of Acre, the Christian dominion in the Holy Land disappeared. Henceforth, the holy places became the possession of the Muslim, and Christian Europe no longer strove to rescue them. The loss of Palestine fatal to the Templars. Public opinion. The wealth of the order excites cupidity. Philip the Fair of France covets the possessions of the Templars. His intrigues to effect his purpose. The Pope. The Templars arrested in France. The extraordinary charges brought against them. They are subjected to torture. They are burned alive. Proceedings against the Templars in other countries. But Vivien, deeming Merlin overborne by instance, recommenced, and let her tongue rage like a fire among the noblest names, polluting and imputing her own self, defaming and defacing, till she left not even Lancelot brave nor Galahad clean. Tennyson. The loss of Palestine led indirectly to the ruin of the Order of the Templars. The record is one of the dark episodes of history, encompassed with contradictions, full of surprises, painful to contemplate, whatever view may be taken, whichever side espoused. It is difficult to understand how an order of men who for nearly 200 years earned the thanks and praise of Christendom for their bravery and devotion, who had shed blood like water to defend the places dearest to all Christian hearts, who had been recruited from the noblest families in every country in Europe, and had princes of royal blood in their ranks, who claimed to act upon the purest and most exalted Christian principles, and who proved the sincerity of their professions by their lives of self-sacrifice and their deaths for the cause they had taken up, who had been honored and favored and dowered with gifts and privileges in gratitude for their exploits, should suddenly have fallen into the blackest crimes. So it is no less difficult to understand how public opinion should turn against them as it did, and how all Europe should set itself to disgrace and despoil, to malign and execrate those who had so long been its favorites and its champions. It is not easy to understand this, and it is painful to read the story in its sad and miserable details. But there are other pages of history that more or less correspond with this, and there are well-known characteristics of human nature that explain how such revulsions of feeling come about. It has never been found difficult to get up a case against those whom the great and powerful have made up their minds to destroy. The best men are fallible and have their weak side. Large bodies of men must contain some unworthy members. A long history can hardly be without blots, mistakes, and crimes. No man's life, if narrowly scrutinized by an unfavorable and prejudiced criticism, but will afford ground for accusation. Then, too, facts may be perverted. Circumstances may be made to bear a meaning that does not really belong to them, and fear and torture may force the weak to say anything that they are required. And finally, the evidence and the judgment of those who have everything to gain by the condemnation of those whom they accuse must always be viewed with suspicion by sober and truth-loving minds. Moreover, in judging the Templars, we must not forget the lapse of time and the change of circumstances that separates our age from theirs. After the loss of Acre, a chapter of the surviving Templars was gathered, and James de Molay, preceptor of England, was elected Grand Master. One more attempt was made to recover a footing in the Holy Land, but it was defeated with great loss to the order, and all hope of restoring the Latin kingdom in Palestine seems to have been abandoned. The occupation of the Templars was gone. They had been banded together to fight upon the sacred soil of Palestine and to defend pilgrims, but now they had been driven out of the country, and they could no longer execute their mission or fulfill their vows. We soon hear of them being engaged in civil or international wars, which seems to be a violation of their oath not to draw sword upon any Christian. Thus we read of Templars fighting on the side of the King of England in the Battle of Falkirk, AD 1298, and similar occurrences are recorded in the French wars of the time. Those against whom the Templars fought would not be slow to complain of them. But the real cause of the downfall of the Templars was probably the enormous wealth of the order. There had not been wanting indications for some years of covetous eyes and itching hands turned towards the possessions of the knights. Sometimes complaints were made because the rents of their estates were all sent out of the country. Sometimes the grievance alleged was that they were exempted from paying taxes and other levies, civil and ecclesiastical. Sometimes open acts of spoliation were committed upon their property, and that even by royal hands. But it was in France that the final attack was made. Philip the Fair was king at this time, a man of bad character and unscrupulous as to the means by which he attained his ends. The country was exhausted and the treasury empty, and the idea seems to have occurred to him, as it did later to Henry VIII of England, under similar circumstances, that an easy way to fill his own purse was to put his hand into the purses of others. But even kings cannot appropriate the property of a religious order without offering some apology or justification to the world. And so it began to be whispered that the Holy Land would never have been lost to Christendom if its sworn defenders had not failed in their Christian character. The whole blame of the defeat of the Crusades was laid upon the Templars. It was said they had treacherously betrayed the Christian cause, that they had treated with the enemy and by their personal sins, especially by secret unhallowed rites, had provoked the just wrath of God, and so brought about the ruin of the dominion of the cross in the east. When Ahab has determined to put Naboth to death, that he may seize his coveted vineyard, it is not difficult to find witness that he is a blasphemer of God and a traitor to the king. And so Philip found his first tool in a man guilty of a multitude of crimes, who secured his own pardon by a denunciation of the Templars. But even a king could not ruin a great religious order without the aid of the ecclesiastical authorities. The Templars had always been favored and protected by the popes, and nothing was in itself so likely to evoke that protection again as an attack upon the order by the secular powers. But Philip was prepared for this. The Pope of the day, Clement V, had been a subject of his own. As Bishop of Bordeaux, he owed his election to the pontificate to Philip's own intrigues, and had been easily induced to quit Rome and live in France so as to be more completely under the dictation of the king. Moreover, the majority of the cardinals were also French and entirely devoted to the king's interests. Clement V was one of the worst of those miserable men who have from time to time disgraced the papal chair, and was guilty of almost every crime. There are, indeed, authorities worthy of credit who assert that before his election he had been made to promise to perform 6 favors to the king, and that the last was not to be divulged till the time for its execution came. This last was then found to be the suppression of the order of the Templars. There was no difficulty under these circumstances in getting the so-called sanction of the Church for an inquiry into the crimes of which the Templars were accused. Accordingly, in AD 1307, Philip issued letters to his officers throughout the kingdom, commanding them to seize all the Templars on a certain day, that they might be tried for crimes of which he and the Pope had satisfied themselves they were guilty. They had apostatized from the Christian religion, worshipped idols in their secret meetings, and had been guilty of horrible and shameful offenses against God, the Church, the state, and humanity itself. Philip professed the most pious horror at what he had discovered. He lamented the grievous necessity laid upon him, and urged upon the guilty men the expediency of a full and immediate confession of their wicked doings as the only way to secure pardon and escape the just and extreme penalty of such outrageous wickedness. It was during the night of October 13th, 1307, that the king's orders were executed. Every house of the Templars in the dominions of the King of France was suddenly surrounded by a strong force, and all the knights and members of the order were simultaneously taken prisoners. At the same time, a strenuous endeavor was made to arouse popular indignation against the order. The regular and secular clergy were commanded to preach against the Templars, and to describe the horrible enormities that were practiced amongst them. It is incredible to us in these days that such charges should be made, and still more that they should actually be believed. It was said that the Templars worshipped some hideous idol in their secret assemblies, that they offered sacrifices to it of infants and young girls, and that although everyone saw them devout, charitable, and regular in their religious duties, People were not to be misled by these things, for this was only a cloak intended to deceive the world and conceal their secret rites and obscene orgies. It was hoped that some confession of guilt might be readily obtained from some of the weaker brethren in order to receive the pardon which was promised by the king. But no such confession was made. All the prisoners denied the charges brought against them. Then the usual medieval expedient was resorted to, and torture was used to extort acknowledgments of guilt. The unhappy Templars in Paris were handed over to the tender mercies of the tormentors with the usual results. 140 were subjected to trial by fire. The details preserved are almost too horrible to be related. The feet of some were fastened close to a hot fire till the very flesh and even the bones were consumed. Others were suspended by their limbs, and heavy weights attached to them to make the agony more intense. Others were deprived of their teeth, and every cruelty that a horrible ingenuity could invent was used. While this was going on, questions were asked, and offers of pardon were made, if they would acknowledge themselves or others guilty of the monstrous wickednesses which were detailed to them. At the same time, forged letters were read purporting to come from the Grand Master himself, exhorting them to make a full confession, and declarations were made of the confessions which were said to have been already freely given by other members of the order. What wonder, then, that the usual consequences followed. Those who had strong will and indomitable courage stood firm and endured the slow martyrdom till death released them, maintaining to the last their own innocence, and the innocence of their order, of the crimes with which they were charged. But some weaker men broke down. In hope of release from the agony which they could not endure, they confessed anything and everything that was required of them. And these things were at once written down as grave facts and made matter of accusation of others. Often these unhappy men almost immediately recanted, and as soon as the torture ceased, withdrew their confessions and repeated their original denial of the accusations one and all. We have long ago ceased to set any value upon confessions extorted by torture, and the system has happily been abolished by all civilized nations. But in those days, this was not understood. Torture was relied upon as a means of extracting truth from unwilling witnesses when all other means failed. Indeed, it was simpler and more expeditious than the calling of many witnesses, the testing of evidence by cross-examination, and other surer but slower methods, and especially when conviction, not truth, was the end in view. Torture was a welcome and efficacious ally. All this was but too sadly exemplified in the proceedings against the Templars in France. No sooner were those who had made confessions of guilt while under torture released from their tormentors than they disavowed their forced admissions and proclaimed their innocence and the purity of their order, appealing to history and the testimony of their own day for evidence of their courage and devotion to the Catholic faith. Upon hearing of this, Philip immediately ordered the rearrest of the Templars, and proceeding against them as relapsed heretics, they were condemned to be burned alive. In Paris alone, 113 suffered this terrible punishment, and many more were burned in other towns. In Spain, Portugal, and Germany, proceedings were taken against the order. Their property was confiscated, and in some cases torture was used. But it is remarkable that it was only in France, and in those places where Philip's influence was powerful, that any Templar was actually put to death. Everywhere else, the monstrous charges were declared to be unproved, and the order was declared innocent of heresy and sacrilegious rites. The Council of Vienne refuses to suppress the order of the Templars. The Pope suppresses it by his own authority. The Grand Master at Notre Dame in Paris, Edward III, of England, slow to attack the Templars. He is persuaded by the Pope to suppress the order in England. Trial of the Templars in London. Monstrous charges. Bell, book, and candle shall not drive me back, when gold and silver becks me to come on. Shakespeaee. In October AD 1311, a council was held at Vienne to dissolve the Order of the Temple, but the majority of the bishops were decidedly opposed to such a proceeding against so ancient and illustrious an order, till its members had been heard in their own defense in a fair and open trial. The Pope was furious at this and dismissed the council, and in the following year, AD 1312, By a papal brief, he abolished the order and forbade its reconstitution. The property of the order in France was nominally made over to the Hospitallers, but Philip laid claim to an immense sum for the expenses of the prosecution, and by this and other means he obtained what he had all along desired, the greatest part of the possessions of the order. Similar proceedings took place in other countries. In some, new orders were founded in the place of the Templars, with the sovereign at their head, by which means the estates came into the possession of the crown as completely as if they had been actually confiscated. In France, the Templars who survived their torture and the horrors of their prisons were either executed or left to linger out a miserable existence in their dungeons till death released them. The Grand Master and a few other brethren of the highest rank were thus kept in prison for 5 years. They were then taken to Notre Dame in Paris, and required to give verbal assent to the confessions which had been extorted from them under torture. But the Grand Master, James de Molay, the Grand Preceptor, and some others seized the opportunity of declaring their innocence and disowning the alleged confessions as forgeries. The old veterans stood up in the church before the assembled multitude, and raising their chained hands to heaven, declared that whatever had been confessed to the detriment of the illustrious order was only forced from them by extreme agony and fear of death, and that they solemnly and finally repudiated and revoked all such admissions. On hearing of this, Philip ordered their immediate execution, and the same evening the last Grand Master of the Temple and his faithful comrades were burnt to death at a slow fire. Impartial men had formed their own judgment, and a very strong feeling prevailed that justice had not been done. It was remarked that those who had been foremost in the proceedings against the Templars came to a speedy and miserable end. The Pope, the kings of France and of England, and others, all soon followed their victims and died violent or shameful deaths. We have somewhat anticipated the order of events, and must return to the earlier stage of the proceedings against the Templars. As soon as Philip had determined upon his own course of action, he desired to find countenance for it by stirring up other sovereigns to imitate it. He therefore wrote letters to the kings of other European states, informing them of his discovery of the guilt of the Templars, and urging them to adopt a similar course in their own dominions. The Pope, too, summoned the Grand Master to France, but with every mark of respect, and so got him into his power before the terrible proceedings against the members of his order were made public. The King of England, Edward II, acted with prudence. He expressed his unbounded astonishment at the contents of the French king's letter, and at the particulars detailed to him by an agent specially sent to him by Philip, but he would do no more at the time than promise that the matter should receive his serious attention in due course. He wrote at the same time to the kings of Portugal, Aragon, Castile, and Sicily, telling them of the extraordinary information he had received respecting the Templars, and declaring his unwillingness to believe the dreadful charges brought against them. He referred to the services rendered to Christendom by the order, and to its unblemished reputation ever since it was founded. He urged upon his fellow sovereigns that nothing should be done in haste, but that inquiry should be made in due and solemn legal form, expressing his belief that the order was guiltless of the crimes alleged against it, and that the charges were merely the result of slander and envy, and of a desire to appropriate the property of the order. At the same time, Edward wrote to the Pope in similar terms. He declared that the Templars were universally respected by all classes throughout his dominions as pious and upright men, and begged the Pope to promote a just inquiry which should free the order from the unjust slander and injuries to which it was being subjected. But hardly was this letter dispatched than Edward received another from the Pope, which had crossed his own on its way, calling upon him to imitate Philip, King of France, in proceeding against the Templars. The Pope professed great distress and astonishment that an order that had so long enjoyed the respect and gratitude of the Church for its worthy deeds in defense of the faith should have fallen into grievous and perfidious apostasy. He then narrated the commendable zeal of the King of France in rooting out the secrets of these men's hidden wickedness, and gave particulars of some of their confessions of the crimes with which they had been charged. he concluded by commanding the King of England to pursue a similar course, to seize and imprison all members of the order on one day, and to hold in the Pope's name all the property of the order till it should be determined how it was to be disposed of. King Edward, notwithstanding his recent declaration of confidence in the integrity of the Templars, yielded obedience to this missive of the Pope. Whether he was overawed by the authority of the pontiff, and deferred his own opinion to that of so great a personage, or whether, as some suppose, he desired to give the Templars a fair and honorable trial and the opportunity of clearing themselves, or whether he gave way to the evil counsels of those who whispered that the great wealth of the Templars would be useful to the crown, and that he might avail himself of the opportunity of taking all, as his predecessors had taken some, of their treasure, whatever may have been his real motive and the cause of his change of conduct, it is certain that he issued an order for the arrest of the Templars and the seizure of all their estates, houses, and property. The greatest caution and secrecy were adopted. Instructions were sent to all the sheriffs throughout England to hold themselves in readiness to execute certain orders which would be given to them by trusty persons on that day. Similar arrangements were made in Scotland, Ireland, and Wales, and on January 8, A.D. 1308, every Templar was simultaneously arrested. It was not till October in the following year that any trial took place. All this time the Templars had been suffering the miseries of imprisonment. More than 200 men of high rank, many of them veterans who had fought and bled in Palestine, and who were now grown old and feeble after a life of hardship and privation, maimed with wounds, bronzed with exposure to the eastern sun, languished under the tender mercies of jailers, with no opportunity of defending themselves or of raising up friends to say a word for them. Some were foreigners who happened to be in England on the business of the order. A few managed to evade the vigilance of the king's emissaries, notwithstanding the secrecy and suddenness of the arrest, and escaped in various disguises to the wild and remote mountain districts of Scotland, Wales, and Ireland. The court appointed by the Pope commenced its proceedings in London in October A.D. 1309, under the presidency of the Bishop of London. Several French ecclesiastics had come over to take their seat upon the bench as judges, an ill omen for the English Templars. After the usual preliminaries, which were long and tedious, the articles of accusation were read. They stated that those who were received into the order of the Knights of the Temple did at their reception formally deny Jesus Christ and renounce all hope of salvation through him, that they trampled and spat upon the cross, that they worshipped a cat, that they denied the sacraments and looked only to the Grand Master for absolution, that they possessed and worshipped various idols, that they practiced a variety of cruel, degrading, and filthy customs and rites, that the Grand Master and many of the brethren had confessed to these things even before they had been arrested. Such is a very brief summary of the accusation, the original documents of which have happily come down to us. It is not easy for us to understand how such a farrago of absurdity, profanity, and indecency could ever have been gravely produced in a so-called court of justice in England as a state paper, a bill of indictment against a body of noblemen and gentlemen, against an order that for 200 years had been the right arm of the Church and the defender of Christianity against its most dangerous and ruthless enemies. No writer of fiction would have ventured on inventing such a trial, and no one unacquainted with medieval history would credit the record that grave prelates and learned judges drew up such a document, and then set themselves to prove the truth of its monstrous allegations by the use of torture. But students of the Middle Ages know well that such things were done in those days. They remember Savonarola and Beatrice Cenci in Italy, Joan of Arc in France, Abbot Whiting and others in England. They call to mind the cruelties and exactions practiced so often upon the Jews in every country in Europe, and with the contemporary records in their hands, they do not hesitate to accept as undoubted historical fact what would otherwise be rejected as a slander upon humanity and an outrage upon common sense. If the Templars had been accused of the crimes vulgarly supposed to attach themselves to religious orders, if they had been charged with falling into the sins to which poor human nature by its frailty is liable, if erring members had been denounced, men who had entered the order through disappointment or from some other unworthy motive, men such as Sir Walter Scott depicts in his imaginary Templar, Brian de Boy Gilbert in his novel of Ivanhoe, we might well believe that some at least of the accusations against them were true. But it is singular that no such charges are alleged against the Templars, though they were freely brought 200 years later against the regular monks by the commissioners of Henry VIII. This fact has been noticed by most thoughtful historians, and has been considered to tell strongly in the tribunal of equity in favor of the Templars. Instead of these probable or possible crimes, we find nothing but monstrous charges of sorcery, idolatry, apostasy, and such like, instances of which we know are to be found in those strange times, but which it seems altogether unlikely would infect a large body whose fundamental principle was close adherence to Christianity, a body which was spread all over the world and which included in its ranks such a multitude and variety of men and of nationalities, among whom there must have been, to say the least, some sincere, upright, and godly men who would have set themselves to root out such miserable errors, or, if they were found to be ineradicable, would have left the order as no place for them. Even Voltaire acknowledges that such an indictment destroys itself. It recoils upon its framers and proves nothing but their intense hatred of their victims and their total unfitness to sit as judges. When this extraordinary paper had been read, the prisoners were asked what they had to say to it, and, as might be expected, they at once and unanimously declared that they and their order were absolutely guiltless of the crimes of which they were accused. After this, the prisoners were examined one by one. Trial of the Templars in London, their defense. They are tortured on the rack, their property is confiscated, Fuller's opinion of the Templars, reasons for the immunity of the Hospitallers, probable ground for some of the charges against the Templars, Hallam's judgment, list of the convents of the Templars in England. I see the modern pilot, whom avails no cruelty to sate, and who unbidden into the temple sets his greedy sails. Dante. It would be tedious to follow the long and wearisome questionings and to record the replies given by the several brethren of the temple during their trial in London. One and all agreed in denying the existence of the horrible and ridiculous rites which were said to be used at the reception of new members, and whether they had been received in England or abroad, detailed the ceremonies that were used, and showed that they were substantially the same everywhere. The candidate was asked what he desired, and on replying that he desired admission to the order of the Knights of the Temple, he was warned of the strict and severe life that was demanded of members of the order, of the 3 vows of poverty, chastity, and obedience, and moreover that he must be ready to go and fight the enemies of Christ even to the death. Others related details of the interior discipline and regulations of the order, which were stern and rigorous, as became a body that added to the strictness of the convent the order and system of a military organization. Many of the brethren had been nearly all their lives in the order, some more than 40 years, a great part of which had been spent in active service in the East. The witnesses who were summoned were not members of the order, and had only hearsay evidence to give. They had heard this and that report. They suspected something else. They had been told that certain things had been said or done. Nothing definite could be obtained, and there was no proof whatever of any of the extravagant and incredible charges. Similar proceedings took place in Lincoln and York, and also in Scotland and Ireland, and in all places the results were the same, and the matter dragged on till October AD 1311. Hitherto torture had not been resorted to, but now, in accordance with the repeated solicitations of the Pope, King Edward gave orders that the imprisoned Templars should be subjected to the rack in order that they might be forced to give evidence of their guilt. Even then there seems to have been reluctance to resort to this cruel and shameful treatment, and a series of delays occurred so that nothing was done till the beginning of the following year. The Templars, having been now 3 years in prison, chained, half-starved, threatened with greater miseries here, and with eternal damnation hereafter, separated from one another, without friend, adviser, or legal defense, were now removed to the various galls in London and elsewhere, and submitted to torture. We have no particular record of the horrible details, but some evidence was afterwards adduced which was said to have been obtained from the unhappy victims during their agony. It was such as was desired, an admission of the truth of the monstrous accusations that were detailed to them, which had been obtained for the most part from their tortured brethren in France. In April A.D. 1311, these depositions were read in the court, in the presence of the Templars, who were required to say what they could allege in their defense. They replied that they were ignorant of the processes of law, and that they were not permitted to have the aid of those whom they trusted and who could advise them, but that they would gladly make a statement of their faith and of the principles of their order. This they were permitted to do, and a very simple and touching paper was produced and signed by all the brethren. They declared themselves, one and all, good Christians and faithful members of the Church, and they claimed to be treated as such, and openly and fairly tried if there were any just cause of complaint against them. But their persecutors were by no means satisfied. Fresh tortures and cruelties were resorted to force confessions of guilt from these worn-out and dying men. A few gave way and said what they were told to say, and these unhappy men were produced in St. Paul's Cathedral shortly afterwards, and made to recant their errors, and were then reconciled to the Church. A similar scene was enacted at York. The property of the Templars in England was placed under the charge of a commission at the time that proceedings were commenced against them, and the king very soon treated it as if it were his own, giving away manors and convents at his pleasure. A great part of the possessions of the order was subsequently made over to the Hospitallers. The convent and church of the Temple in London were granted in A.D. 1313 to Aymer de Valence, Earl of Pembroke, whose monument is in Westminster Abbey. Other property was pawned by the king to his creditors as security or payment of his debts, but constant litigation and dispute seem to have pursued the holders of the ill-gotten goods. Some of the surviving Templars retired to monasteries. Others returned to the world and assumed secular habits, for which they incurred the censures of the Pope. The possession of the lands and estates of the Order of the Templars seems to have entailed misfortune upon its owners. Aymer de Valence, to whom the king granted the temple in London, was shortly afterwards murdered and left no descendant. The Duke of Lancaster, who subsequently held it, perished upon the scaffold after his unsuccessful rebellion. Hugh le Despencer, the next owner, also came to a violent end, and was hanged with a crown of nettles on his head. The temple then came for a short time into the hands of the Knights Hospitallers, and during the reign of Edward III, it seems to have been occupied by the lawyers as tenants under the Hospitallers. When that order was dissolved by Henry VIII, the property passed into the hands of the crown, the lawyers still holding possession as tenants. This continued till the reign of James I, when a petition was drawn up and presented to the king asking him to assign the property to the legal body in permanence. This was accordingly done by letters patent in A.D. 1609, and the benchers of the Inner and Middle Temple received possession of the buildings on consideration of a small annual payment to the crown. So passed away and came to an end the ancient and noble order of the Templars. As Fuller says, the chief cause of the ruin of the Templars was their extraordinary wealth, as Naboth's vineyard was the chiefest ground of his blasphemy, and as in England Sir John Cornwall, Lord Fanhope, said merrily, not he, but his stately house at Ampthill in Bedfordshire, was guilty of high treason, so certainly their wealth was the principal cause of their overthrow. We may believe that Philip would never have taken away their lives if he might have taken their lands without putting them to death. But the mischief was he could not get the honey unless he burnt the bees. It may be wondered why the Hospitallers escaped when the Templars fell. There was much similarity between the two orders. Both were wealthy, both had been founded to defend Palestine, and when that was lost, if one order was unnecessary, why should the other be preserved, and even be made the inheritor, at least nominally, of the property of the other when it was suppressed? There are probably several reasons for this seeming contradiction. One is that, as the downfall of the Templars was really due to Philip of France, who commenced the outcry against them, there were local causes that gave him a handle against the Templars which were not available against the Hospitallers. Another, and a stronger reason, is that the Hospitallers were still, and for 300 years afterwards, actively engaged in war with the Muslim, and so they were useful as standing upon the distant threshold of Christendom, and in keeping back the dreaded enemy from advancing too rapidly upon the fair countries of Europe. It has been maintained by some that there was probably some ground for the accusation that at his initiation the Templar was required to spit or trample upon the cross. In those days of symbolism and mystic rites, when attempts were made to realize everything in sacred history, especially when a sharp line was drawn not only between the church and the pagan, but between the monastic life and the life even of professing Christians in the world, so that the title religious and the phrase entering religion were given to those who became monks or nuns, there may very probably have been peculiar ceremonies used at the admission of a Templar into his order, as there were, we know, when a monk or a nun made profession. In the latter case, the novice, in some orders, is treated as a dead person, and lies upon the floor of the church covered with a pall, and is as it were raised to life by admission into the privileged position of a member of the order. So it is said the Templar came as a renegade from Christ, having in theory, if not in fact, denied him by a bad life, and now desired repentance and restoration, and to make a new beginning. His former state was indicated by his spitting or trampling upon the cross, and then he began a new and higher life of penitence and self-sacrifice as a member of this order. It is said also that the Templars had some advanced theories respecting man's access to God in direct opposition to the spirit of the age, that they denied the necessity of the Pope and of church rites, and approached God as the universal Father. In fact, that they were Protestants before the time, Protestants of the most pronounced views such as the Quakers or the Unitarians now advocate. But all this rests upon slight and uncertain grounds, and upon data that may have vastly different meanings. There is no doubt that their intercourse with the East brought them into contact with many religious opinions and speculations which at that time were unknown in Europe, but which the loss of Constantinople and the immigration of so many Eastern refugees afterwards introduced to the thinking minds of the West. The revival of learning, the study of Greek, the rise of free thought are by many dated from this event, which led to the importation of Eastern learning and Eastern mysticism into Europe. It does not seem impossible that the Templars may have anticipated something of this in their own order by long sojourn in Palestine, and by their wider knowledge and more liberal opinions may have alarmed and scandalized the narrower minds of the clergy of the West. Curious, and in some cases objectionable symbols are found carved in their churches, and antiquarians identify these with signs used by ancient Gnostic sects, and so go on to suppose that the Templars shared the opinions and followed the practices of those sects. Hallam reviews the controversy and confesses himself unable to come to a satisfactory conclusion or to give a final opinion as to the truth or falsehood of all this, and others equally capable of forming a calm judgment hesitate to pronounce one in the case of the Templars. Probably the matter will never be quite cleared up, but will remain like many other insoluble problems of history, about which men will form and hold their own views, while the generous and charitable will give the accused the benefit of the uncertainty, and count those innocent who have not been proved guilty. With the Templars, says Hecathorn, perished a world. Chivalry, the Crusades ended with them. Even the papacy received a tremendous shock. Symbolism was deeply affected by it. A greedy and arid trading spirit rose up. Mysticism, that had sent such a glow through past generations, found the souls of men cold and incredulous. The following is a list of the preceptories of the Templars in England: Cambridgeshire, Wilbraham; Essex, Temple Crossing; Hampshire, South Badesley; Hertfordshire, Temple Dinesley; Kent, Swingfield; Leicestershire, Temple Rothley; Lincolnshire, Aslackby; Temple Brewer, Eagle; Maltby, Mere Wilketon, Witham; Norfolk, Haddiscoe; Shropshire, Halston; Suffolk, Gislingham, Dunwich; Sussex, Saddlescombe; Warwickshire, Balsall, Warwick; Yorkshire, North Ferriby; Templehurst; Temple Newsome, Pafleet, Flaxfleet, Ribston. The order also possessed many manors and estates where they had no preceptories.